Good evening, everyone. Long weekend, and it is warm. It is nice. I was actually on a boat earlier today, so actually I was sitting there, I'm like, whoa, oh, it's the hall moving. Hey, but it's really good to see you all. If you have joined us for the first time, and welcome you. We've been going through the series on the book of Timothy, a pastoral letter written by Paul to Timothy. And the first week we were talking about him charging Timothy with lots of things. Michelle talked about Paul charging Timothy to uphold truth. And then the next week was Johnny talking about charging him to pray for leaders, to pray for all kings, people in charge. Because leading is hard. Those of us who are in leadership positions, in any kind of capacity, you will know that it is hard. Having to make decisions, having to take responsibility, having to be considerate to others, having to remain humble whilst you are in charge. All these things present to us a really big challenge. And at the beginning of this series, I presented to us the question, where is the love? What would love have me do? The whole point of the command, the goal of the command, the aim of the charge is love that issues from a pure heart, a good conscience, and a sincere faith. And as we're talking about that, as we're thinking about, okay, so where is the love? Really, then, and where is the church in regards to this? The next real question that we are going to ask today is, where are the leaders? Where are the leaders who are going to be showing us how to love? Where are the leaders who are going to be showing us how to conduct ourselves? And we're talking about this issue of leadership. And this has been on my heart a lot these last few years, particularly these last few years, because we have seen all kinds of leaders in all parts of the world leading in all kinds of ways, right? We have all these leaders who are doing it in their own ways, and we're all arguing about which leaders are right, which leaders are wrong. And here we are, presented with this question that we should turn back to ourselves. Where is the church in regards to this? Is the church becoming a leader in society? Is the church setting an example about how we ought to behave, which is what Paul just said to Timothy? Thank you, Timothy, for reading that out as well. So today we're going to look at this issue of leadership, and we're going to turn to 1 Timothy 3 that Tiffany read. And you know what this whole passage is basically a job description. It's a job description of what a leader should be. And those of you who are leaders, maybe you're looking at it going, do I measure up to this list? This is a tough list. This is a high calling. This is a high bar for what a leader should be. And if you're a leader, this should send you at least into some level of anxiety, or at least questioning yourself is, am I these things? Am I addicted to too much wine? Am I truly the leader that God is asking me to be? Now, this kind of job description is very different to what the world shows. We're in a season now where I'm talking to a lot of young people who are applying to university. And what do you do when you apply to university? You tell this university all the things that you have done, or all the things that you are associated with, even if it's not fully accurate. And when you're applying for a job, you are telling them all the things, all the teams that you have been on, that you don't specify that you weren't doing much in those teams, but at least that you are in those teams doing those things. It's all about what you've done. All about what you've done, and maybe in this city, it's all about what you know. But what we see here is God is here doing a job description. And it's not really about what you've done. It's about who you are. It's not about what you ought to do. It's about who you ought to be. And so we see something that's very different as we look at when God is hiring for a leader. When God is looking for a leader, he is asking for very different things to the things that we're asking for. I follow this Instagram account by this pastor called Honest Youth Pastor, and he has some really interesting things that he says. And he says there's one thing that actually has stuck into my mind. It's been engraved in my mind. And he says, you know what? Churches assign and appoint leaders without looking at 1 Timothy 3 and then wonder why their churches are falling apart. Churches appoint leaders without looking at 1 Timothy 3 and then wonder afterwards why their churches are falling apart. God has made it so clear what kind of leaders that we're looking for, yet do we often look at this leader? And you know what? Scripture says that leaders will be measured by a different stick. And that terrifies me, but that also keeps me in line. And as I look at this passage here, and we're going to look at this, is let's reflect on what it means for us right now, for those of us who are leaders and for those of us who are hoping to be or aspiring to be leaders. And we see that it's not about what we do, but it's about character. God cares more about what is inside rather than just on the outside. So actually, there's no really clever way to separate it. I'm just going to go through verse by verse, actually. So as we look at this, before I jump into it, I guess a little bit of context here. Ephesus, which I said last time, it was this vibrant city with all these people. It was booming in terms of its economy, all the trade going on in there, and the church was starting to grow, growing in all these little house churches. But the problem was, as people were coming in to the church, they were starting to argue. People from all walks of life, with all kinds of preferences, with all kinds of experience and status, were coming in and demanding to be heard. And then that's the context that we're in right now. That Paul is writing to Timothy, this young pastor, saying, hey, look, you need to establish and appoint a leadership in your church that has this criteria, because otherwise there will continue to be quarreling. There will continue to be fighting. There will continue to be heresy and domineering. And that is not what we want. The church is in its early state, and it needs to start off in the right way. So he starts, and he says this in verse 1. The saying is trustworthy. If anyone aspires to be the office of overseer, he desires a noble task. He starts off with this. He says, the saying is trustworthy. Why does he say that? Again, context. We said with the first chapter was about upholding truth, because there was all this rubbish, all this meaningless arguing about genealogies and all these other things and all these myths. And he's saying, hey, look, if you want something true, if you want to hold on to something, if you want to take this to the bank, take this to the bank. Those who aspire to be leaders. The word overseer here, it can be translated as elder, pastor, or shepherd. Someone who looks after a group of people. That's what overseer is providing spiritual oversight, is providing teaching. And he says, this is a trustworthy saying. This is true. This is fact. Anyone who aspires for that kind of role desires a what? A noble task. Not a self-serving one, not just to climb up the ladder, not just to get another badge on your arm, but this is a noble one. This is a selfless one. And actually, everyone should aspire to that kind of level, have that kind of heart to lead people, to serve them. So that's where we go into, and he says, he desires a noble task. Verse 2, therefore an overseer, an elder, shepherd, pastor, must be one above reproach. You can't find obvious faults with this person. You can't see obvious sins in their life. That's not to say that there isn't underneath, but just at the very beginning, you can't see these things that actually, they have to be above reproach. And then the second one is this. Some of them I'll go through a little bit more, and some of them I'll just, because people will be easy to understand. You have to be the husband of one wife. The husband of one wife. Now, this isn't targeting and being against single people and saying, hey, if you're not married with one wife, you can't do this. This is more addressing the issue of having someone who is in a committed and faithful relationship. Just one wife. Just committed and faithful to one. You see, I stop there, and sometimes I read through this, and it's so fast. And of course, it's the right thing. You shouldn't cheat, and leaders in the church definitely shouldn't cheat. And I just skim over it. But then I stop, and then you know what? We're now in a stage in the church, in society, where the fact that has to be said is still very, very important, because we're in a place where church leaders are falling one by one to this same problem. And so we need to take this verse seriously, that actually this leader needs to be committed and needs to be faithful, doesn't fall in to the same temptations and desires of the flesh. Husband of one wife. He has to be sober-minded. Sober-minded. This is different to just someone who is not addicted to too much wine. When someone is sober-minded, they are vigilant and they are aware and they are even-keeled. And I'll tell you why the leaders of those days needed to be sober-minded, because at that point, the church was again in a very vulnerable state. It was just about to take off, it was just about to grow, but it was still facing persecution. It was facing all this heresy that was coming in. Every day you'd probably get new news about someone being chased down, someone being targeted. So what you needed was a leader who wouldn't panic. Not a leader that would be too anxious. Not a leader that would react to any kind of news that they would hear. Someone who was even-keeled, sober-minded, vigilant, and aware of all the challenges that the church would face. We need leaders who are sober-minded, self-controlled, respectable, hospitable. Hospitable is an interesting one. Hospitable was very, very important. Well, it is important now, but it was super important back then. Why? Because the churches were in the homes. Can you imagine if this leader wasn't hospitable, who didn't want people to step into their home? Have a think a little bit now when you last walked into someone's home and that person was very hospitable. What did they do for you? When you walk in, they probably, well, if it's a Chinese household, they probably kind of passive-aggressively tell you to take your shoes off by giving you some flip-flops to wear. And then you come in and, leave your bags over here. I'll put your mask here and maybe spray you. And then what do they do? And they'll be like, would you like something to drink? Would you like something to eat? Take a seat here. Take a seat here. This is, don't sit there. Don't sit there. Sit here. Sit where it's comfortable. You see, someone who is hospitable, what does that really mean? That means someone who is willing to put the interests of others first. It's considering others more significant than yourself. This is Philippians 2. This is, if you're going to be a leader, you have to be considerate. You have to be caring. And it was especially important in the church in those days because that's where the church grew, within the home. So you needed a home and you needed a leader who was hospitable. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later as well. And carries on, and able to teach. The next ones are pretty self-explanatory. Not a drunkard, not violent, but gentle, not quarrelsome, not a lover of money. Again, here it goes into the negative now and saying you can't be drunk, you can't be violent, but you have to be gentle. Not to say that you have to be soft. Gentle doesn't mean soft, right? Gentle means that you have a strength that you are restraining, that you are holding back. That's what gentle means. Gentle doesn't mean weak and soft. So you have to be all those things. This is a tough list if we go through. And verse 4, it says this: he must manage his own household well, with all dignity, keeping his children submissive. For if someone does not know how to manage his own household, how will he care for God's church? Here, Paul steps it up a notch. He's talking about, hey, you're thinking about being a leader in a church, but I want to look into your house. I want to look into your home. He doesn't separate them. He joins the two together. But how often do we actually look at someone and not really care about what their home is like, not really care about what they're like in their personal life? We just look at their CV, we look at their experience, we look at their accolades, and we go, okay, you can be a leader. But we haven't checked into what their home is like. Actually, the secularization of the church sometimes has led to us just appointing leaders without looking and saying, you know what? Family is so important. And only when you look at someone's family do you then see, okay, so this is how is this a God-fearing man? Because a God-fearing man would lead a family who is also God-fearing. Now, of course, there are also exceptions to that in the sense that you can do everything you need to do as a parent, but maybe it's ultimately up to the kids who choose whether they follow Christ. But in terms of the whole household, what Paul is doing here, he is tying the church with the family. They are one and the same. He's saying a well-ordered family leads to a well-ordered church. You just imagined a hospitable home that you walked into, but maybe change and think of another home that you walked into that was like, oh my goodness, this is absolute chaos. Imagine if that was a home. Would a church thrive there? No. So Paul is here reminding, hey, you know what? The primary force, the primary platform for discipleship is where? Is in the family. He talks about this. God talks about this in the Old Testament in Deuteronomy 6. Hey, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And then teach them diligently to your children. When you stand up, when you sit down, when you walk over there, when you walk over there, hang it on your doorpost, hang it on your gate, put it on your ceiling. Love the Lord your God. He's saying these two are the same. Discipleship happens in the home. But you see, the problem here is this. Sometimes, and I'm terrified with this, and actually a lot of pastors are, you hear this term, pastor's kids, and you hear how they often go AWOL because they're just so used to being in the church and seeing all these things and doing all these things. But the one that really breaks my heart the most is when they sense hypocrisy in their parents, in their pastors' parents. Where they say, oh, my parents are so nice to the people outside, to the people that they're pastoring, but to me, they're nothing like that. In fact, I never see them at home. That's the thing that really drives me the most, and is a constant reminder for me, is actually my children are my first line of ministry that I have to deal with. And so for leaders, when you look at someone and you're thinking, could that person be a leader? Paul's saying here, look at their home, look at their family, look at their wife. Because how they treat their wife and their kids, how they treat their home, will tell you a little bit about what kind of leader they are. This is a high bar. Then he carries on, verse 6. He must not be a recent convert, or he may become puffed up with conceit and fall into the condemnation of the devil. He must not be a recent convert. That's an interesting one. Surely, the moment you accept Christ, we're all on equal ground. Surely, we're all allowed to be leaders from there. But Paul's saying no. Again, this is to do with the context of what was happening. The church was growing. The city was a vibrant, buzzing city. CEOs were coming in to the church. And CEOs were coming in, still being recent converts, knowing really nothing about the faith, apart from the fact that they feel as though they've encountered Jesus and they've given their lives to Jesus, but they still felt as though they were in control. And so then, and everyone else, knowing who they are, knowing how wealthy they are, they let them take the roles. But Paul's saying here, no, that's not it. Don't let them, because they're still spiritual babies. And this is where we as a church constantly have to reflect. Are we placing people on pedestals when actually maybe they're not supposed to be there? It still comes back to the heart. It still comes back to character. But so often, and I can say this confidently and safely because I truly believe that our church here has a group of leaders and deacons who are truly God-fearing and God-honoring, and who are not here by their own status. But so often, institutions and churches appoint people who are of worldly success and who bring those values into the church, and then we wonder why that we can't really separate the church and the world. Paul is saying here, God is saying here, choose your leaders carefully. These people have to be fearing of me. And they can't be recent converts. And finally, verse 7 for this section, overseers. Moreover, he must be well thought of by outsiders so that he may not fall into disgrace, into a snare of the devil. So people on the outside of the faith, people who aren't Christians, have to look at this person and go, oh, he's a good person. He has to be filled with, why? The primary mission of the church at that stage, and it still remains to be at this stage, it's evangelism. And he's saying, your leaders can't be weird. Your leaders can't be people who are rude. But other people outside have to like them, because the whole goal is to show them that we are different. The whole goal is to show them that Jesus is different, that he transforms our lives. And if they're not well thought of by the outsiders, they will fall into disgrace. So these are the elders. These are the overseers, the people who are pastors or shepherds. This is the modern day pastor, hopefully. Should be. And then we move on to the second part, which is the qualifications for deacons. This is so business-like almost, but he makes it very clear. Who are deacons? The word deacons, the original word, means the one who serves. And we first see deacons in Acts 6, where the apostles are so busy ministering to people, and then people weren't getting fed, and so a group of them said, hey, you know what? Apostles, you do you. We know that you're important and you're going to be ministering to people. We need some other people to help you distribute the food. So then they started appointing deacons, people who would help with the administration, the practical needs of the congregation. And we talked about some of the popular, famous ones. Acts 7, you got Stephen. Acts 8, you got Philip. And so deacons have continued to be part of the history of the church, and they form such a valuable part of the church because they're the ones who basically look after the practical needs of the church. But they also need to be qualified. They also have a high bar to reach. Like deacons, likewise, verse 8, must be dignified, not double-tongued. They can't be gossipers, not addicted to too much wine, not greedy for dishonest gain. Again, we see here that power was a struggle, but also money was a struggle here. They must hold the mystery of the faith with a clear conscience. A lot of the deacons, they're dealing with the practical needs of the congregation. And what does that often end up with? Dealing with money. And the corruption that was starting to even appear even in those days. Paul was addressing, saying, no, these people need to have a clear conscience. They need to be holding the mystery of the faith. They need to know why they're here. They need to know how they are saved. And they need to hold that tension and deal with all the practical needs of the congregation with a clear conscience. And let them also be tested first. Then let them serve as deacons if they prove themselves blameless. Let them be tested. These deacons must be tested. The two things that really pop up, commentators really talk about, one way is really that they need to be tested in terms of their beliefs, their doctrine. Again, it all goes back to the false doctrine, the heresies. These people need to be tested. They need to be doing the right things for the right reasons, believing in the right things. So tested, but also in the sense that these people need to be tested through some of the challenges of life. You don't truly know someone's true colors until they've gone through something hard. Only when they go through challenges for all of us. Maybe these last 2 years, that's been the great exposer, right? It's been the biggest revealer of the heart of man. As soon as things go wrong, we start to see what's really in our hearts. And so Paul's saying here, don't rush it. Don't appoint people who are recent converts. Don't appoint them if you haven't really tested them first. Take your time. It's that important. So, and let them also be tested. Verse 11, their wives likewise must be dignified, not slanderers, but sober-minded, faithful in all things. Let deacons each be the husband of one wife, managing their children and their households well. Verse 13, for those who serve well as deacons gain a good standing for themselves and also great confidence in the faith that is in Christ Jesus. So that's it. That's the job description that God places for overseers and for deacons. And let me just stop right there for a second. How does that list make you feel? Maybe start with the first sentence there. How does this task make you feel? Is it something that you completely shirk away from? Or actually, is it something that you truly aspire to? Because those who aspire to it aspire to a noble task. This is a good thing. And for those of us who are leaders, we need to check ourselves on this list, constantly asking God, if you've called me to be a leader, what kind of leader should I be? You see, I look at this passage and I see all of this, and often a lot of it is explanatory, but the feeling that I got as I read through this, as I prepared this, is this, and it's a statement that I put up there, that the world truly needs more godly leaders. We look around, whether it's our churches, whether it's our families, whether it's the companies that are around, whether it's the cities, whether it is the countries. The world is in deep need for godly leaders. So the question to us is, where are these godly leaders? But these godly leaders cannot be of this world. We've just seen a job description that runs contrary to how the world appoints leaders. And it's important for us to ask ourselves that question. Are we aspiring to be the godly leaders that God has called us to be? Measuring ourselves up to this list in chapter 3, do we strive for these kind of standards? Do we live by example ourselves? The world needs more godly leaders, but the godly leaders cannot be of this world. You look at this list and you see that so often, even in the church, we have separated spirituality from our personal life, from our domestic life, from our professional life. But what Paul's saying here is that a true leader has integrity. What is integrity? What's the definition of integrity? Integrity is when someone is consistent and the same wherever they are, whether it's in the home, whether it's in the church, whether it's at work. And this is a good chance for us to reflect. Are we people of integrity? Am I the same wherever I go? Do I hold to the same values? Or am I really just a Sunday Christian or a Saturday evening Christian? God, especially for leaders, demands the whole of our lives. He demands an integrity that crosses over every area. And it's important because if we don't get our leaders right, then our families, our churches won't be right. And leaders can only truly lead when they are pulling and not when they are pushing. This is something that my dad had often said, and he was a leader in the church, and he was also a lecturer of MBA in university. So he spoke about leadership a lot, and he had this lame example, which I think I've shared sometimes, is leadership is like a string. You can only move that piece of string when you pull it in the direction that you're going yourself. You can never push a piece of string. The whole analogy, the point of that is a leader can't take a group of people where they're not willing to go themselves. And it starts with the leader. If the leader goes, then everyone else will go. The organization, the family, the church will only go as far as the leader is able to take them. And it starts with the leader. And the church, God has called the church to be a leader in the world. So we have to be the first ones to be a good example, to show love, to uphold truth, to pray, to be humble, to be gracious, to be merciful to the people outside, to be joyful. We have to be the ones that do it first. We have to be filled with integrity as we go about our way. So I've really talked about what an overseer is and what the Bible talks about, what a deacon is, and that the fact that the world is in desperate need for godly leaders, but that these leaders also cannot be of this world. So I've talked about what a leader is and how they should be a leader. But really the question I want to finish with is, why? What's the point in all of this? And it finishes off here with an interesting passage. I'm going to jump to verse 14 now. Verse 14 says this, "The mystery of godliness. I hope to come to you soon, but I'm writing these things to you so that if I delay, you may know how one ought to behave in the household of God, which is the church of the living God, a pillar and buttress of the truth." So he's talking about the church. He's constantly charging Timothy to lead this church well. Why? Three things. He really highlights three key traits of the church. One, it's a household of God. This is a home. Again, family and church, they are the same thing. I don't know whether when you walked into this church, whether you felt as though you were coming home. I loved what Johnny said earlier. Welcome to this spiritual home. This has to be your home. This is not an institution. This is not a country club. This is not where you get entertained. This is not a cinema. This is a group of believers who all proclaim their faith in Jesus Christ, committed to each other, bound by the blood of Christ, coming together as a family. We are a household of God. We are not, by the way, a household of Peter or John or James. We are a household of God. So that's the first thing Paul says. This is a family. This is a family. And when you're in a family, Chinese people understand this best, you bring something into the family. You are invested into the family. You are part of this family, whether you like it or not sometimes. What you can't do in a family is just simply sit back. Sit back and judge. Sit back and completely detach. That is not what it's about. We need leaders who know that this is a family. This isn't a corporation to run. This isn't a company that we're trying to grow. This is the household of God. Second point then. First one is household of God. Second is the church of the living God. Why does he specify living God? He's saying, hey, this is the church of the living God as opposed to all your other temples where there are dead gods. This is a living place. He's calling them out of the pagan world and say, leave those idols, leave those pagan gods and come to me because I am the living God. And by the way, I am alive. You are not in charge. I am in charge. I am the CEO of this church. There does not need to be a power struggle. And I am here, by the way, guys, so I don't know what you're arguing about. It's the church of the living God, which separates itself. And finally, the pillar and buttress of the truth. That word simply means defender of the truth. Coming back to, hey, the reason why we're here is because we have been revealed the truth and we know it is to be true. So the church needs to be that, and we need leaders who understand that it is a family, it is a house. We need leaders who understand that they are leaders, but the best leaders are the best followers of Christ. That these are leaders, but they are not God. These are leaders, these are pastors, these are deacons, but they are not the CEOs of this institution. That this is the household of God, the living God, and he is the one who's on the throne. You see this picture in Revelation 4 where you have all the 24 crowns and all the elders, and all of them, each one of those would terrify us if we saw any of them. But yet all of them are bowed down, worshiping the one who is truly on the throne. And that's the kind of leader that we need in the church. People who have their eyes fixated on the true King. The best leaders are the best followers of Christ. And then it really finishes with this, and this is the last verse, verse 16. And he actually finishes with a song. So for worship people, you'll be pleased to see this. He finishes with a song. Verse 16, great indeed, we confess, is the mystery of godliness. He was manifested in the flesh, vindicated by the Spirit, seen by angels, proclaimed among the nations, believed on in the world, taken up in glory. He finishes by pointing, after talking about the job description, he points people to the only truly perfect leader. He's saying, hey, verses 1 to 13 is a very high bar. It is impossible for you to get there yourself. But look, someone did. And that someone is Jesus. So you as a leader, when you're struggling with these things, you look to Jesus. You as a leader, when you're tempted just to throw these things away, look to Jesus. And what he has here in this verse 16, this panoramic view of his plan of salvation for all of us. He goes from Bethlehem to the ascension. He summarizes who Jesus is, where he came from, and where he went. And he reminds people that it's all about Jesus. When you are struggling to be a leader, look to Jesus, the truly only perfect leader, and provides us with this sample, provides us with this model to follow. And I'll finish here. As we worship now, as we as we really meditate on what God has spoken to us, let us heed that call when God says, "Where is my church?" You are supposed to be leaders in this world. And it doesn't have to be leaders of big corporations, of which I know some of you here are. In which case, God has given you lots of influence, lots of power, which then comes with lots of responsibility, as the great theologian said in Marvel. But if you are like, "Oh, I don't know if I'm a leader," you are, because you are the salt of the earth and you are the light of the world. God has placed friends, placed colleagues, placed family around you who don't know about the true hope that can be found in Jesus. They haven't met the truly perfect leader. They might come and complain to you about their boss or their lecturer or their friends. Your job is to lead them to the perfect one who will never let them down. So take pride in that. Boast in the Lord that he has chosen you and placed you exactly where you are and called you to that place to reach that high bar with him and point people to him. All of us here are called to be leaders in some way. And my prayer is that we would answer God's call when he asks, "Where are the leaders?" And let us lead by example with integrity and filled with love. Let's pray. Jesus, we look to you with all our flaws, with all the mistakes that we've made. But Jesus, we do truly aspire to lead. Truly aspire to be the people who get to lead others to you. But Lord, we know that starts off with us following you first. Humbling ourselves, opening ourselves up to you, to committing to following you. And Lord, you show us the perfect example of leadership. Lord, you are the servant king. And you led in a way that was countercultural to the way this world leads. And we have fallen so far short because we think to lead, we use our own might and use our own wisdom. And we rely on our own pride that drives us. So we humble ourselves before you right now. So lead us to the cross. Lead us back to your feet. And again, we pray for the leaders in this church and in this city. From the ones who only have one person to lead to those who have thousands. May we all fall at your feet as we lead. May we lead with the humility that you led with. May we lead with the integrity that you led with. May your church, may your body be leaders in love. So empower us, Holy Spirit. Fill us up and send us out to be the leaders you've called us to be. Thank you.